March 27, 1942. Saint-Nazaire occupied France. 01:34 hours. The night smells of salt, diesel, and the particular metallic tension that precedes violence. Corvettenkapitan Erich Müller stands watch on the outer mole of the Normandy dock, the largest dry dock in the Atlantic, listening to sounds that violate the rhythm of coastal occupation duty. The Loire estuary carries fog inland from the Bay of Biscay, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 meters, but sound travels with perfect clarity across water, and what Müller hears makes no tactical sense. A ship's engine, running at combat speed, approaching the harbor directly rather than following the swept channel, its bow wave audible now as a continuous hissing roar that suggests either navigational incompetence or suicidal intent. He raises his binoculars toward the outer harbor and sees nothing but fog and darkness. Then the fog parts for 3 seconds. Moonlight illuminates the estuary, and Müller's throat constricts around words that refuse to emerge. A destroyer, flying British naval ensign bow pointed directly at the dock's southern caisson gate, is charging through the outer defenses at 17 knots, with the inevitability of an avalanche. In the instant before he screams for the alarm, Erich Müller understands that everything the Wehrmacht believes about coastal fortress security is about to be demolished by men who treat fortifications not as obstacles but as targets. The Atlantic Wall represented Nazi Germany's ultimate defensive architecture, a fortress system stretching from Norway to the Spanish border that consumed millions of tons of concrete, tens of thousands of troops, and absolute confidence in the principle that static defense, properly engineered, rendered amphibious assault impossible. By 1942, the French Atlantic coast bristled with gun emplacements, observation posts, minefields, and garrison troops trained in the methodical procedures of fortress warfare, coordinated fields of fire, interlocking defensive positions, and the psychological certainty that any attacker would be detected, engaged, and destroyed long before reaching critical infrastructure. The doctrine was sound, proven in the First World War's Western Front fortifications, and reinforced by engineering excellence that made German coastal positions among the most formidable defensive works in military history. The harbors received special attention. Saint-Nazaire's Normandy dock could accommodate the largest warships in the world, including the battleship Tirpitz, making it a strategic asset whose destruction would force German capital ships to transit to ports in occupied Norway for major repairs. The facility was protected by overlapping defensive layers, naval mines in the approach channels, anti-aircraft batteries surrounding the harbor, machine gun positions covering the dock gates, and garrison troops billeted in reinforced positions throughout the port complex. Intelligence estimates suggested that any conventional assault would require sustained aerial bombardment, followed by amphibious landing in division strength, an operation requiring weeks of preparation and logistical buildup that would provide ample warning for reinforcement. The British had different ideas. In the aftermath of Dunkirk and the catastrophic defeats of 1940, Churchill authorized the creation of specialized raiding forces, trained not in conventional infantry tactics, but in what would later be called special operations, small unit actions designed to achieve strategic objectives through speed, surprise, and absolute disregard for conventional military wisdom about acceptable risk. The Commandos and Special Air Service emerged from this directive, units composed of volunteers who treated impossible missions as professional challenges rather than suicide orders. Their training emphasized night navigation, close-quarters combat, demolitions, and the psychological dimension of warfare that recognized fear as a weapon more effective than artillery when properly deployed. They studied German defensive procedures, identified vulnerabilities in fortress doctrine, and developed assault tactics specifically optimized to exploit the gaps between theoretical security and practical vigilance. The Atlantic Wall was formidable. The Commandos were learning to make formidable irrelevant. The first major raid shattered German coastal security assumptions with the finality of a hammer through glass. Operation Claymore, launched against the Lofoten Islands in March 1941, demonstrated capabilities that Wehrmacht fortress doctrine had never contemplated. 500 commandos, transported by naval vessels, descended on Norwegian coastal installations in a coordinated assault that combined precise navigation, overwhelming local firepower, and withdrawal timing calculated to the minute. The raiders destroyed fish oil factories critical to German glycerin production, captured encryption materials and Norwegian collaborators, and evacuated before reinforcements could respond. Total British casualties, 1 man wounded. Total operation time, 6 hours. The psychological impact exceeded the material damage. German coastal garrisons throughout occupied Europe received urgent directives to increase vigilance, improve coordination between observation posts, and establish rapid reaction protocols for responding to seaborne raids. The directives revealed institutional confusion about how to counter an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. How do you defend against attackers who appear from darkness, strike with concentrated violence, and vanish before defensive systems can engage? Fortress doctrine assumed attackers would attempt to seize and hold territory. The Commandos seized objectives, destroyed them, and departed, treating defended positions not as obstacles requiring systematic reduction, but as targets for surgical strikes. The German response emphasized what military bureaucracies always emphasize when confronted with tactical innovation: more of everything. Increase guard rotations, expand defensive perimeters, improve communication systems, establish overlapping observation zones. The defensive preparations were thorough, professional, and fundamentally inadequate because they addressed conventional threats rather than the specific challenge posed by raiders who operated under different tactical assumptions. A garrison can guard against attackers attempting to breach defenses and advance through contested terrain. How does that same garrison guard against attackers who arrive by sea in the middle of the night, assault positions from unexpected directions, and withdraw before reinforcements can deploy? The answer, delivered through bitter experience over subsequent raids at Vauxhall, Bruneval, and Saint-Nazaire, was that conventional fortress doctrine provided no effective answer. The Commandos had identified a vulnerability at the intersection of human psychology and defensive architecture. Fortifications make defenders feel secure, and security breeds routine, and routine creates predictable patterns that can be studied, timed, and exploited. The Atlantic Wall was magnificent. The men garrisoning it were competent professionals, and neither magnificence nor competence was sufficient against an enemy that had systematically analyzed fortress warfare's fundamental assumptions and designed tactics to make those assumptions lethal liabilities. The turning point in German understanding arrived not through intelligence analysis, but through interrogation of a captured commando following a raid on the Channel Islands in October 1941. The prisoner, a sergeant from No. 12 Commando, proved unexpectedly willing to discuss training methods and tactical philosophy, apparently convinced that general procedural information could not compromise future operations. His interrogators, initially skeptical, gradually recognized they were receiving education in an entirely new approach to coastal warfare. British commando training, the sergeant explained, began with volunteer selection that prioritized psychological characteristics over conventional military excellence. The ideal candidate demonstrated initiative, adaptability under stress, and what the training cadre called aggressive patience, the ability to wait motionless in hostile territory for hours before exploding into coordinated violence. Physical conditioning emphasized endurance and practical strength over parade ground aesthetics. Tactical instruction focused obsessively on night navigation, teaching men to move across unfamiliar terrain in complete darkness, using dead reckoning, star positions, and terrain association rather than maps and compasses. The demolitions training was particularly revealing. Rather than learning general explosives theory, commandos practiced destroying specific target types: dock gates, railway bridges, fuel storage facilities, radar installations, until they could calculate charge placement and fusing requirements under combat stress with the automaticity of trained reflexes. They studied German defensive architecture through captured documents and aerial reconnaissance photographs, identifying structural weaknesses and optimal placement points for explosive charges. Every raid was preceded by detailed planning that included scale models of target facilities constructed from intelligence reports, allowing assault teams to rehearse attacks until movement patterns became muscle memory. But the most disturbing element was psychological preparation. Commandos were explicitly trained to exploit the gap between theoretical alertness and practical attention that characterized all garrison duty. German sentries, the sergeant explained, maintained excellent discipline during initial posting hours, but inevitably experienced attention degradation after midnight as fatigue and routine dulled vigilance. Raids were timed to strike during the circadian low point between 0100 and 0400 hours, when human reaction time slowed and decision-making quality degraded. The attackers arrived fresh, pumped with adrenaline, executing rehearsed assault patterns against defenders struggling to transition from routine watchstanding to combat alertness. The interrogation report circulated through Wehrmacht coastal defense commands with recommendations for enhanced security procedures. The recommendations were implemented with typical German thoroughness. They proved entirely insufficient during the Saint-Nazaire raid 5 months later, when theory encountered practice and practice won decisively. The psychological fractures within German coastal garrisons deepened through late 1941 and early 1942, as the cumulative weight of successful British raids eroded the fundamental assumption that fortifications provided security. Troops garrisoning Atlantic Wall positions began experiencing the specific form of combat stress that emerges not from direct engagement, but from persistent vulnerability. The knowledge that at any moment, on any night, raiders might materialize from darkness and transform routine guard duty into lethal combat before defenders could react effectively. The stress manifested in predictable patterns. Sentries reported phantom contacts, sounds in the darkness that might be surf breaking on rocks or might be assault boats approaching shore. False alarms became so frequent that garrison commanders faced an impossible dilemma: respond to every report and exhaust troops through constant stand-to procedures, or ignore probable false alarms and risk missing actual attacks. Either choice degraded defensive effectiveness. The fear was not irrational cowardice but justified concern based on demonstrated British capabilities. Previous raids had proven that commandos could penetrate defensive perimeters, destroy objectives, and withdraw before coordinated response became possible. Letters home, monitored by military sensors, revealed deteriorating morale. One Gefreiter garrisoning a coastal position near Calais wrote, "We stand watch every night knowing that the British may come, and if they come, we will likely die before understanding what is happening. This is not combat. It is waiting for murder." Another soldier described the psychological toll. During the day, the fortifications feel impregnable. At night, every shadow becomes a threat, every sound a potential attack. We are defending positions that feel like traps. The Wehrmacht attempted to address morale problems through rotation policies that prevented troops from spending more than 6 months on coastal garrison duty. But the policies created their own problems. Experienced sentries who had learned to distinguish actual threats from environmental sounds were replaced by newcomers who either responded to every stimulus or became dangerously complacent. The institutional knowledge necessary for effective defense never accumulated because personnel turnover prevented the development of unit cohesion and experiential learning. Meanwhile, British commando units were refining tactics through operational experience, building institutional expertise that made each raid more efficient than the last. The asymmetry was profound. Defenders scattered across thousands of miles of coastline, uncertain when or where attacks might occur, gradually worn down by stress and routine. Attackers concentrated on specific objectives, thoroughly rehearsed, striking with overwhelming local superiority before vanishing into darkness. The mathematics of this equation favored the raiders. The logistical and intelligence infrastructure supporting commando operations represented a dimension of British capability that German analysts struggled to comprehend even after capturing detailed operational planning documents. The raids that appeared to Wehrmacht garrison commanders as almost supernatural manifestations of British audacity were actually the visible component of elaborate support systems involving naval coordination, aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and networks of French resistance operatives providing real-time information on German defensive dispositions. The planning cycle for a major raid began months before execution with comprehensive intelligence collection. RAF reconnaissance aircraft photographed target facilities at multiple times of day, capturing shadows that revealed gun positions, patrol patterns, and structural details invisible in overhead imagery. Resistance networks reported garrison strength, rotation schedules, and the locations of ammunition storage and command centers. Signals intelligence monitored German communication patterns, identifying which units occupied specific sectors and how they coordinated response to alerts. This accumulated information was synthesized into detailed target packages that allowed commando planners to identify vulnerabilities, optimal approach routes, and critical timing windows. The naval support infrastructure was equally sophisticated. Coastal Force motor launches and modified destroyers transported raiding parties across the Channel using navigation techniques that combined dead reckoning, celestial positioning, and radio direction finding to achieve landfall accuracy measured in meters rather than kilometers. Crews trained in night navigation until they could identify approach landmarks by silhouette recognition alone, maintaining radio silence during transit to avoid German direction-finding stations, while still arriving at precise coordinates within minutes of scheduled times. The raiders themselves benefited from equipment specifically designed for assault operations. Commando knives were manufactured to exacting specifications emphasizing silent killing capability. Demolition charges were pre-packaged for specific target types, dock gates, bridges, locomotives, with fusing systems that could be armed quickly under stress. Weapons included suppressed pistols, submachine guns optimized for close-quarters combat, and grenades with reduced detonation signatures that minimized acoustic detection. Most critically, the entire operational system incorporated systematic lessons-learned procedures. After-action reports from each raid were analyzed for tactical insights, equipment failures, and procedural improvements. Successful techniques were codified into training programs, ensuring that organizational knowledge accumulated rather than remaining isolated in individual unit experience. The result was a force that became more capable with each operation, refining doctrine through empirical testing against the most heavily defended coastline in Europe. German defenders faced not a static threat, but an adaptive enemy that learned faster than defensive procedures could evolve. The impossible moral weight of coastal garrison duty crystallized in the individual choices faced by soldiers who understood intellectually that British raids were statistically improbable against their specific position, while simultaneously knowing that for the unlucky few who actually encountered commandos, the probability was irrelevant. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann, commanding a reinforced platoon garrisoning the outer defensive positions at Saint-Nazaire, embodied this dilemma in the weeks before Operation Chariot's execution. Hartmann was a conscientious officer who took defensive responsibilities seriously. He conducted irregular patrol schedules to prevent pattern recognition, rotated sentry positions to maintain alertness, and insisted on rigorous rehearsal of alert procedures. His defensive sector included observation posts overlooking the Loire estuary approaches, machine gun positions covering the outer mole, and communication lines directly to the harbor command center. By any objective standard, his unit was well prepared to detect and engage seaborne raiders. Yet Hartmann's personal journal revealed corrosive doubt about whether preparation was sufficient against an enemy that had repeatedly demonstrated capability to overwhelm prepared positions through tactics that defied conventional military logic. The doubt created operational paralysis. Should he maintain maximum alert status indefinitely, exhausting his troops and degrading long-term defensive effectiveness? Or should he accept normal garrison routines and risk being unprepared if the statistically improbable raid actually occurred? The choice was fundamentally unsolvable because both options contained fatal flaws. Maximum alertness was unsustainable. Normal routine was vulnerable. There was no third option. Hartmann chose a middle path, elevated but sustainable vigilance with periodic surprise inspections and irregular alert drills designed to maintain readiness without inducing exhaustion. It was a rational compromise between competing demands. It proved catastrophically insufficient at 0134 hours on March 28, when HMS Campbelltown, a destroyer laden with 4 tons of delayed action explosives concealed in forward compartments, smashed through the outer harbor defenses at combat speed while commandos aboard raked defensive positions with automatic weapons fire. Hartmann's first awareness of the attack came not from his carefully positioned observation posts, but from the sound of the destroyer's impact against the Normandy dock's southern caisson, a metallic shriek followed by secondary explosions that lit the harbor like daylight. His defensive positions were bypassed entirely by an attack that ignored conventional approach routes and treated fortified harbor defenses as obstacles to be crashed through, rather than methodically reduced. By the time his troops deployed to engage the commandos now swarming ashore, the assault teams were already moving toward pre-assigned demolition targets, with the efficiency of men executing rehearsed choreography. The German response to the Saint-Nazaire raid represented the culmination of 18 months of escalating British commando operations and the Wehrmacht's increasingly desperate attempts to develop counter-tactics against an enemy that operated according to fundamentally different operational principles. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, which successfully destroyed the Normandy dock and rendered it inoperable for the remainder of the war, German coastal defense commands implemented comprehensive security reviews that produced recommendations ranging from practical to absurd. increase garrison strengths, expand minefield barriers, establish backup communication systems, position rapid reaction forces at central locations, and somehow maintain maximum alertness indefinitely across thousands of miles of coastline. The recommendations revealed institutional confusion about the nature of the threat. Traditional fortress doctrine assumed that defensive strength derived from physical barriers and coordinated firepower, concepts proven across centuries of siege warfare. The Commandos had demonstrated that modern raiding tactics could render physical barriers irrelevant through speed and surprise, and that coordinated firepower was useless if defenders couldn't identify targets before attackers completed their objectives and withdrew. The Wehrmacht was attempting to solve a 21st century problem with 19th century solutions. Meanwhile, commando operations expanded in scope and sophistication. Raids that had begun as company-sized harassment operations evolved into battalion-strength assaults, combining naval gunfire support, aerial bombardment, and multi-axis attacks designed to overwhelm local defenses through sheer violence of action. The SAS, operating in North Africa and later in occupied Europe, pioneered deep penetration tactics that struck targets hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, demonstrating that no coastal position was truly secure if raiders were willing to accept the risks of extended insertion and extraction operations. The psychological impact on German defenders transcended tactical concerns and touched upon fundamental questions about the defensive mission's purpose. If fortifications could be penetrated, if garrison forces could be overwhelmed before reinforcements arrived, if critical infrastructure could be destroyed regardless of defensive preparations, what exactly was the garrison defending? The question had no satisfactory answer, and the absence of answers created a morale crisis that manifested in increased desertion rates, higher rates of combat stress casualties, and the gradual erosion of the confidence that had characterized German coastal forces during the early occupation years. Oberleutnant Hartmann, cashiered following the Saint-Nazaire disaster, despite having followed all prescribed defensive procedures, wrote in his final journal entry, "We defended against the enemy we expected, rather than the enemy who came. This failure was not individual but institutional. We were trained for a kind of warfare that no longer exists." The convergence of British offensive capability and German defensive adaptation reached critical density in the summer of 1942, when parallel evolutions in raiding doctrine and counter-raiding procedures created conditions for confrontations that would test whether fortress defenses could evolve faster than assault tactics. The British had refined commando operations into a systematic operational capability, with standardized training, specialized equipment, and institutional support that treated raids as strategic weapons rather than tactical harassment. The Germans had responded by creating dedicated anti-raider forces, improving coordination between coastal artillery and mobile reserves, and implementing defensive procedures specifically designed to counter nighttime seaborne assault. The test case arrived with Operation Jubilee, the Dieppe raid of August 1942, which represented the largest commando operation to date. 6,000 troops, including Canadian infantry and British commandos, assaulting a heavily defended port in a combined arms operation designed to test amphibious assault doctrine and gather intelligence on German defensive capabilities. Unlike previous raids that had emphasized surprise and surgical strikes, Dieppe was partially a deliberate attack against prepared defenses, exactly the scenario German coastal doctrine was designed to defeat. The battle revealed both the maturation of German coastal defense and the limitations of commando tactics when applied to conventional amphibious operations. German defenders at Dieppe, warned by intelligence intercepts and heightened alert status, engaged landing forces with coordinated artillery, machine gun fire, and tank support that inflicted catastrophic casualties. The raid failed in most of its objectives, with British and Canadian forces suffering over 50% casualties during the withdrawal. German defenders demonstrated that when properly alerted and reinforced, Atlantic wall positions could indeed repel amphibious assault through conventional defensive procedures. But the raid's failure actually confirmed commando operational philosophy. Raids succeeded when they achieved surprise and struck objectives before defenders could coordinate response. Dieppe failed precisely because it abandoned those principles in favor of a deliberate assault that gave defenders time to prepare and organize. The two flanking commando operations, attacks on coastal batteries at Berneval and Varengeville, succeeded despite heavy defenses because they maintained the speed and surprise that characterized effective raiding tactics. The lesson was clear. Commandos were surgical instruments, not siege hammers. Applied correctly, they could accomplish objectives that conventional forces could not. Applied incorrectly, they suffered casualties like any other infantry unit attempting frontal assault against prepared positions. The question was whether German coastal commanders would learn the correct lesson from Diepp's mixed results. The preparation for the war's final phase saw both British and German forces consolidating lessons learned from 3 years of raid and counter-raid operations along the Atlantic coast. The British refined commando doctrine toward precise surgical strikes against high-value targets, acknowledging that raids worked best when limited to objectives achievable through surprise and violence of action rather than sustained combat. Training programs emphasized stealth over firepower, withdrawal discipline over holding captured positions, and mission completion speed above all other considerations. The Commandos were becoming what modern military theorists would later call special operations forces, units designed for missions where conventional forces either could not operate or would suffer disproportionate casualties. German coastal defenses evolved toward layered, redundant systems that accepted the inevitability of successful penetration while attempting to limit damage through compartmentalized defensive zones and rapid reaction protocols. The Atlantic Wall's construction accelerated under Rommel's supervision in 1943-44, with emphasis on obstacles that would slow attackers long enough for reinforcements to engage them in sustained combat. Exactly the scenario where commando advantages disappeared. Beach obstacles, extensive minefields, and pre-registered artillery zones created depth that compensated for the impossibility of maintaining maximum alertness at all points simultaneously. The psychological dimension had fundamentally shifted. German coastal garrisons no longer expected invulnerability but focused instead on resilience, the ability to absorb raids, limit damage, and maintain functional defensive capability despite successful penetrations. British commandos, meanwhile, had developed a professional culture that accepted extraordinarily high risk as the price of strategic effect. The mutual respect between raiders and defenders had grown through shared experience. Captured commandos reported professional treatment from German interrogators who recognized fellow soldiers rather than terrorists, while British after-action reports acknowledged the improving competence of coastal defense forces. The final test of these evolved systems would come not through raids but through the D-Day invasion itself, where commando operations would serve as the spearhead for conventional amphibious assault. Units like the British 6th Airborne Division and American Rangers would conduct the kinds of surgical strikes that commandos had pioneered, seizing key bridges, eliminating coastal batteries, securing beachhead flanks, but now integrated into a massive conventional operation rather than isolated raids. The techniques developed through years of nighttime coastal strikes would prove essential to the invasion's success, validating the operational philosophy that fortifications could be defeated through tactics that treated physical barriers as targets rather than obstacles. The fearless reputation was earned. The lessons would shape amphibious warfare doctrine for generations. The direct confrontation that crystallized the evolution of raid and counter-raid doctrine arrived on the night of June 5, 6, 1944, when commando units spearheading the D-Day invasion executed operations that combined 3 years of institutional learning into coordinated assaults against German coastal defenses. The raids represented the ultimate expression of the tactical philosophy developed through Saint-Nazaire, Dieppe, and dozens of smaller operations. Achieve surprise through unconventional insertion methods, overwhelm local defenses before coordination becomes possible, complete objectives with extreme speed, and transition immediately to the next phase rather than attempting to hold captured positions. British 6th Airborne Division conducted the assault on Pegasus Bridge and Merville Battery, operations that exemplified refined commando doctrine. At Pegasus Bridge, glider-borne troops landed within 50 meters of their objective at 00:16 hours, stormed the bridge defenses in 7 minutes of close-quarters combat, and secured the crossing before German reinforcements could respond. At Merville Battery, paratroopers conducted a coordinated assault against casemated gun positions, penetrated the defensive perimeter using Bangalore torpedoes and direct assault, destroyed the guns with demolition charges, and withdrew before heavy German counterattacks arrived. Both operations succeeded through the principles that had proven effective across 3 years of raiding: detailed planning, rehearsal until execution became automatic, and overwhelming violence applied at precisely the right moment. German defenders fought with professional competence but faced tactical problems that defensive doctrine provided no effective solutions for. How do you defend fixed positions against attackers who arrive from unexpected directions, assault from multiple axes simultaneously, and complete their objectives in minutes? The Atlantic Wall's fortifications were formidable when engaged conventionally, but proved vulnerable to tactics specifically designed to exploit the gap between theoretical defensive strength and practical limitations of human vigilance and reaction time. The casualties reflected this asymmetry. German coastal positions suffered catastrophic losses during the initial commando assaults. Entire defensive sectors overrun before they could coordinate response or call for artillery support. British commando casualties were significant but far lower than conventional infantry attacking the same positions would have suffered. The raiders achieved their objectives not through superior numbers or firepower, but through superior tactical application of speed and surprise against defenders who, despite years of preparation and increasingly sophisticated defensive systems, remained vulnerable to the fundamental principle that the commandos had perfected. Appear where the enemy doesn't expect you, strike before they can react, and vanish before they can organize pursuit. The apex of the commando legacy arrived not in the dramatic successes of D-Day itself, but in the institutional transformation those successes represented. British Special Operations Forces had evolved from improvised raiding parties created in the desperate aftermath of Dunkirk into sophisticated military instruments with standardized doctrine, specialized equipment, and training systems that could produce operationally ready commando units at scale. The transformation reflected fundamental lessons about modern warfare that transcended specific tactical techniques, that fortress defenses, regardless of physical strength, remained vulnerable to human factors like fatigue, routine, and the psychological assumption that defended positions provided security, that small, highly trained units could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their size when employed against critical vulnerabilities, and that tactical innovation could trump numerical and material superiority if applied with sufficient boldness and precision. The German perspective on this evolution was complex and increasingly respectful. Captured Wehrmacht officers, interrogated after D-Day, acknowledged that commando operations had forced comprehensive revision of coastal defense doctrine and demonstrated capabilities that German special forces had attempted to replicate through units like the Brandenburgers. The respect was professional rather than fearful. Recognition that the British had identified a dimension of warfare and systematically developed capabilities to dominate it. One senior German officer summarized the assessment. The commandos fight wars of intellect supported by courage, not wars of courage supported by intellect. They win through superior preparation, not superior bravery, though they possess both. The institutional legacy proved more enduring than specific tactical successes. Post-war special operations forces in British, American, and Allied militaries were directly descended from commando doctrine, inheriting the emphasis on volunteer selection, rigorous training, detailed planning, and mission objectives that prioritized strategic effect over conventional military metrics like territory seized or enemy forces destroyed. The SAS evolution from desert raiders to global special operations force demonstrated the scalability of principles developed along the French Atlantic coast. Small teams, thoroughly prepared, striking high-value targets with precision, and withdrawing before conventional forces could engage. The psychological impact on those who fought against the commandos persisted through post-war decades. German veterans of coastal garrison duty described the specific dread of nighttime watch, the knowledge that darkness might bring raiders who transformed routine security duty into lethal combat with no warning beyond the first explosions or gunfire. The fear was not irrational but empirically justified, a professional assessment that fortifications provided inadequate protection against enemies who refused to fight conventionally. The revelatory transformation transcended tactical success and touched upon fundamental questions about military effectiveness, institutional innovation, and the relationship between material strength and operational capability. The commando phenomenon demonstrated that modern warfare's decisive dimension was not physical fortification or numerical superiority, but the systematic application of intelligence, training, and tactical innovation against specific vulnerabilities identified through rigorous analysis. The Atlantic Wall represented the culmination of fortress engineering, millions of tons of concrete, elaborate defensive systems, garrison forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Yet this immense physical infrastructure proved vulnerable to small teams of raiders who understood that defensive strength was contextual rather than absolute, and that context could be manipulated through tactics specifically designed to exploit the gaps between theoretical and practical security. The moral weight of this realization was profound for both attackers and defenders. British commandos had demonstrated extraordinary courage, certainly, but their success derived fundamentally from superior preparation rather than superior bravery. They studied German defensive procedures, identified vulnerabilities, developed specific tactics to exploit those vulnerabilities, and rehearsed operations until execution became automatic. The courage was in accepting the mission, knowing the risks. The victory was in making courage tactically effective through systematic preparation. This represented a maturation of military thinking that acknowledged bravery as necessary but insufficient. Tactical competence required wedding courage to intelligence, planning, and institutional support systems that could sustain operations across years of sustained combat. For German defenders, the experience provided painful education about the limits of fortress doctrine in an era of specialized assault forces. The soldiers who garrisoned Atlantic Wall positions fought with professional competence and often considerable personal courage. But competence and courage proved inadequate against an enemy that had systematically analyzed defensive assumptions and developed tactics to make those assumptions lethal. The lesson was not that German troops were inferior. Captured commandos consistently reported facing skilled defenders, but that defensive doctrine had failed to evolve as quickly as offensive tactics, creating vulnerabilities that raiders exploited with devastating consistency. The strategic implication was clear. In modern warfare, static defense was fundamentally vulnerable to mobile attack, unless defenders could match attackers' institutional learning speed and tactical innovation capability. Physical fortifications provided advantages, certainly, but those advantages could be nullified by enemies willing to study, adapt, and accept the risks inherent in operations that treated fortresses not as impregnable obstacles, but as complex systems with exploitable weaknesses. The Coastal War continued through the final year of European combat, but the fundamental dynamic established by 1942 never changed. British commandos and later Allied Special Operations Forces maintained the initiative through tactical innovation and systematic preparation, while German coastal defenses fought to contain damage and maintain functional capability despite repeated successful penetrations. The asymmetry persisted because it reflected institutional rather than individual qualities. One side had built learning organizations that systematically refined doctrine through operational experience, while the other struggled to adapt defensive procedures faster than attackers evolved offensive capabilities. The legacy extended far beyond the specific tactical techniques developed along the French Atlantic coast. Post-war military forces across the world incorporated commando principles into specialized units that treated unconventional operations as systematic capabilities rather than improvised, desperate measures. The SAS, U.S. Special Forces, and countless similar organizations traced direct lineage to the raid and counter-raid evolution of 1940-44, inheriting the doctrinal emphasis on volunteer selection, exhaustive training, detailed mission planning, and objectives defined by strategic effect rather than conventional military metrics. The institutional DNA persists. Small teams, thoroughly prepared, executing surgical strikes against high-value targets with precision that conventional forces cannot achieve. For the veterans who participated in the coastal warfare's brutal evolution, the experience provided education that transcended military tactics and touched upon deeper truths about fear, preparation, and the relationship between individual courage and institutional effectiveness. German garrison troops learned that courage was insufficient without tactical competence, that vigilance degraded under routine regardless of discipline, and that fortress walls provided psychological comfort more than actual security against determined raiders. British commandos learned that success required wedding exceptional bravery to exceptional preparation, that reputation could become a weapon as effective as demolition charges, and that strategic effect often mattered more than tactical victory. The Atlantic coast remembers through preserved fortifications that testify to defensive ambition and rusted German bunkers that once housed troops waiting for raids that might never come, but sometimes did. The lesson survives in every special operations force that conducts rehearsal until execution becomes muscle memory. that studies enemy procedures until vulnerabilities become visible, that accepts extraordinary risk in exchange for strategic effect. The Commandos prove that fearlessness without preparation is suicide, but preparation channeling fearlessness becomes unstoppable. The coast remembers. The doctrines endure. The legacy continues wherever soldiers study how small teams can defeat fortresses through intelligence, courage, and systematic excellence.